Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Exploiting the Dark Web to Gain Information Advantage, sponsored by CACI on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Corey Everton, the head of Bluestone Analytics at CACI, and Jim Schrant, the director of strategy and growth also at CACI. In the last segment, we talked a lot about what is the dark web. We talked kind of some education about the technology that's behind it or within it or around it. But there are things that I think folks need to know about risks. And it's not just use it or don't, it's understanding when you use it, what you need to be aware of, how you need to balance it. So Corey, I'm going to go to you to start this segment and talk a little bit about what are some of those risks that agencies and really anyone really should keep in mind.
Sure. We've highlighted some of the risks already in the earlier segment, talking a little bit about the risk of malware, but there's a lot more than just that you're risking exposure to when you enter the dark web. One of the most important risks that you have to mitigate against is actually exposure to the violent or offensive imagery that can and does exist in these networks. It's one of the primary avenues for sharing that information that would be more moderated on the open web websites, and kind of protecting the analyst's mental health in this space is vitally important as well. There's also the risk of your signature and the risk of prying eyes in this environment. Who's watching what your infrastructure is connecting to, where you're connecting from, all of that can add additional exposure to your agency and could impact your mission success. So you've really got the exposure of your agency at risk. You have the exposure of your hardware via the malware, and then also just that the agent themselves and their exposure to the violent and offensive imagery that persists.
Is there ways to mitigate those risks? I know there are, but like maybe how do you stay out of the violent and offensive imagery so you only focus on the things you really need to focus on? Or is it like anything else, not to search certain keywords on Google for fear of getting back some results you don't want?
I think it's a combination of things. I think one is training and having that OSINT training to know how to safely navigate in that environment and what technology exists to help mitigate those risks. And technology is that other component. And there are a lot of technologies such as Dark Blue and Dark Pursuit that can help minimize those risks, whether it be producing a text-only view of the information or the ability to blur images so that you're not having unnecessary exposure.
Jim, is that part of the challenge that a lot of agencies are facing when it comes to, do we use the dark web? How do we use the dark web? Is the fear of, I don't really know what I don't know, and only thing I know is it's bad. There's violent images, there's offensive imagery. I'd rather just not play in that world at all.
That's exactly the case, Jason. So the intention almost universally across government agencies is a strong desire to want to be more effective in utilization of open source intelligence and then make it work for what their missions are. However, the risks are considerable. So that risk calculus, whether it be understanding what the technical risks are, understanding what the policy and legal risks are, or simply the risks of exposure to really offensive images to the analysts within an agency. So those are really important things that every agency are trying to weigh and consider. And what's important is, with our information advantage strategy, we've really come to unify and mitigate those risks for the government by enabling the appropriate technology to get the government on safely and make sure that they're able to operate in an anonymous environment where that agency risk in terms of those prying eyes from those technical threats aren't going to come back to trace it back. Additionally, the ability to really exploit all the material that's out there in a sensitive manner. So the ability to blur images, do things to really protect the workforce. And equally important is making sure that you have a well-trained workforce that really knows what they're doing so they don't unintentionally put themselves or the agency at unnecessary risk. So those are clear risk mitigation factors that we're in a position to really help the government achieve so that they're able to get those operational successes.
I want to go back to something that Corey said just briefly, because I don't think we spent enough time on it. And Corey, you make a really great point about protecting or helping to ensure that the mental health of the analysts are taken into account. Like a lot of times when we go into the world of intelligence and the world of analysts, whether it's cyber or open source or human, that mental health side doesn't get talked about. Is that a recognition among agencies that that is an important aspect of this entire effort? Is that growing? Is it new? Is it something that we've seen a big change recently?
I think it's growing. I think that awareness is growing, and the acknowledgement of it and the need for opportunities to minimize that is certainly kind of at the forefront of a lot of the decisions on how do you access this environment safely and securely. The risk of exposure is very great to content that is just not present on the open web and can really take a toll on an individual's health. And I think acknowledging that, but also acknowledging that our adversaries know that and sometimes use our reluctance to enter those environments as an advantage. We have to find ways to mitigate the risk while still acting in these environments in a way that protects health and also doesn't let us not go into these areas just because they're dark. There's ways to safely do that and securely do that without sacrificing mental health.
I think it really speaks to the value and the risk of open source intelligence, because a great example is in law enforcement, there was always strong attention paid toward investigators and analysts working sexual crimes units, crimes against children, because there is a clear mental impact. So there's maturity in that space. Well, with the open source, where it really becomes Pandora's box of opportunities to help achieve greater intelligence understanding, you get into some really dark corners of that box really quickly and oftentimes unintentionally. So one of the key components is obviously the training to understand it, but this is where the technology abilities to, once again, not see something that you don't have to see, or you can choose to see it or not see it, becomes really important to not only conducting just your daily mission, but to keep yourself in as healthy a position as possible. So we're seeing greater value placed on that by agencies, and certainly the technological capabilities are mirroring that to make sure that we can ensure that enablement happens.
Jim, Corey, we've talked a lot about the big picture. Let's drill down a little bit. We know open source is being used within the government. We know ODNI, Army, and I did some research prior to our conversation today. I saw a lot of folks talking about open source. When it comes to the dark web, are there actually agencies who are taking advantage of it, or agencies using it to improve their mission? Jim, you want to start us off?
There are. We're increasingly seeing monthly, if not weekly, a growing list of agencies that, if not are showing interest, are actively engaged in conducting their missions and fully utilizing their missions in the dark web. That becomes important as we start to dive into what those threats look like on the dark web. So a great example of it is the fentanyl threat. The fentanyl threat on the dark web is immense, and it really represents what that entire threat structure to the US government looks like. You have a range from Chinese chemical companies that are openly selling pure fentanyl. They're selling the precursor chemicals to produce fentanyl, and then the elements such as pill presses to stamp out those counterfeit fentanyl pills, all on the dark web. Who's that customer? That customer most oftentimes ends up being Mexican cartels that want to conduct their business in an anonymous environment. So that becomes a ready point of both information exchange and the ability to conduct these transactions to these key components to fentanyl. We also see American citizens directly going on the dark web to acquire these pure fentanyl components or pill presses and et cetera, to help really drive that. And where we're in an environment where we're likely to exceed 120,000 overdoses in 2023, overdose fatalities in 2023, that becomes a very clear national security threat that is actively operating in an hourly basis on the dark web.
Corey, there's other examples too. I think Jim's example of fentanyl, and I imagine that includes the FBI, includes probably Customs and Border Protection, and includes a bunch of different agencies who all play a role into that. Are there other ones that are maybe people may not think about? Fentanyl, unfortunately, is top of mind for many reasons.
Yes, I think a very important data source that we find on the dark web are leaked data sources from ransomware groups, from hacker groups, and these may be operating and actually targeting nation states or working for nation states, and they're distributing that information in a way that allows individuals to go out and collect that information. And it can be incredibly vital to national security to be aware of what information is available out there. Another data source that we see and an emission that we can support on the dark web is, Jim mentioned the child sexual abuse material. We can combat those crimes against children by targeting this environment where threat actors are using the environment to share and distribute their abuse material, and you can help disrupt those networks as well.
So that mission applicability of what's happening on the dark web from a threat standpoint really transcends federal law enforcement, Department of Defense, and what a lot of their missions look like, and also the intelligence community. Because as Corey spoke to, it ranges anywhere from Mexican and cartels to Chinese chemical suppliers to nation states or rogue actors operating against nation states, posting that information out there. So that ability to get on and really harness that and exploit it from a US government standpoint really becomes essential.
Jim, Corey, we got about less than a minute left. So I just want to give you both maybe about 30 seconds or less. What's the big takeaway from our conversation today? We talked a lot about the workforce. We talked a lot about training. We talked a lot about guardrails, cautions. What do you want to make sure that we leave the audience with? Corey, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just that the dark web is a vital part of the OSINT data cycle. We have the technology to be able to safely and securely operate in this environment and not leave any important data clues unturned.
And Jim, give you the last word.
Exploitation of open source data is absolutely essential to the government mission. Through proper technology, through training, and then ultimately the right industry partners, that ability to really obtain information advantage is apparent. However, it's a process. And I think there's a number of processes that really need to be driven and aggressively pursued in order to do that, because it's a very achievable mission.
Very much enjoyed our conversation today. I learned a lot, and I know we'll have more to talk about this in the coming months and years. But that's all the time we have for today. So let me thank my guests. Corey Everton is the head of Bluestone Analytics at CACI. Corey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Jim Schrantz is the Director of Strategy and Growth, also at CACI. Jim, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Exploiting the Dark Web to Gain Information Advantage, sponsored by CACI on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search CACI.